Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Truth Defender podcast. We are coming to you from the greatest country in the world, deep in the heart of the Lone Star State, Dallas, Texas. I'm your host, Paul Aguilar. We really appreciate you guys stopping in. If you guys are catching us on YouTube, please make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button as well as hit that bell icon. Make sure you guys hit that thumbs up as well. That'll really help us out with the algorithm. If you guys are catching us on the go and want to check us out, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeart Radio at Truth Defender Podcast. We're going to go ahead and link all the social media platforms below, but you can catch us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Rumble. We also have a Discord if you guys want to check us out. And if you guys have any questions or comments for myself or a guest, you can send us an email at thetruthDefender1776@gmail.com. Our next guest is Adele Rocha. She has traveled extensively to over 26 countries and has compiled accounts of terrifying and uncanny experiences in both her native country of the Philippines and abroad. Adele starred as Alisa Simon in episode 2 of the pilot UFOs over Earth, while she was a field investigator for MUFON. Her personal experiences with the bizarre has led to a lifetime quest investigating sightings and paranormal events through eyewitness reports. You can catch her book, Portal, A Lifetime of Paranormal Experiences, on Amazon as well. It's a great book. I actually have ordered it. I'm just waiting for it to get here so I can read it. But without further ado, Miss Adele Rocha. How you doing, ma'am?
Very good. Nice to be on your show, Paul.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time. So like, as I mentioned before we started recording, my wife's from the Philippines, and I discovered you as I was trying to get her to relay stories about the Philippines, anything that she had, like of any kind of ghosts or like any kind of UFO stuff or anything. But my wife's not too much into that kind of stuff, so she didn't really have anything for me. But I decided to do my own research, and I came across your book as well, and I caught you on Coast to Coast, so that was great. So I just wanted to just reach out and see if you can go ahead and relay, some stories for us here. But first, before we get to that, do you have any kind of social media where anybody can find you? Like,
I'm
Twitter?
actually on Twitter under the same name, but I'm also pretty prominent on Facebook under the same name, which is actually my pen name. I have a very different name in person.
Sure.
I put together this name for the express purpose of people being able to pronounce it, and sometimes it doesn't work that way, but I'm glad you perfectly pronounced it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess we can start off by how you came about writing this book. I know I had read some of the inserts about them being personal experience, like stories that you have encountered over the time, like over the years. How did that come about, and how did you get into writing the book?
Well, it's a very interesting beginning. I actually didn't mean to write this book. I had a very extensive history, having been born and raised in the Philippines.
Right.
I didn't emigrate to the US until I was 13 years old.
Okay.
Before I moved to the US, I had a series of encounters, and actually my entire family had a series of encounters. And this is interesting, Paul, because of all the shows that I have done, radio and podcast, I'm actually going to do a little revelation here that I've never revealed before in previous guest appearances that I have done. And I'll tell you why. I retired from a school district back in June, and that was actually a retirement that began in March because of the COVID, the pandemic.
Right.
So we were prematurely sent home.
Sure.
So I have been home for almost a year now, kind of like quote unquote lockdown.
Right.
And after having done all those shows, I decided I'm just going to be very frank and just let people know this book, which I do have a copy of for the purpose of this show here. I would say about half of it is actually autobiographical. And what I mean by that is all the experiences, which I referred to in the character of Lisa. For those of you that have not read it, there is a character who starts off as a 2-year-old child in the first few chapters of the book. I refer to her as Lisa. Lisa was born and raised in a small suburb, what was then a very tiny suburb outside of Metro Manila. For those of you that are not familiar with the Philippines, if you just kind of take your finger, go to a globe or Google Earth in this case, and if you look for China, which is pretty huge, what you're going to find is you're going to go to the right of China, and right across where the South China Sea is, you're going to see a tiny little country that's about the size of England. And it is probably, I would say, semi-attached, not quite attached to Indonesia on the south. That is the Philippines. And if you look at the head of it, to me, it looks kind of almost like a dog that's sitting with one arm or one leg extended. If you look at the dog's eye, that's where Manila is. I was born and raised in a town that's probably about, I would say, an hour outside of Manila. That town was the site of a lot of World War II incidents. That's probably kind of like a polite way of saying it. There's massacres that occurred there. There's a lot of soldiers who were killed on both sides, actually, Filipino and Japanese.
Sure.
In that little town of San Juan, there were unofficial burial grounds. There were people who got buried there, bodies were never discovered. And that's where the stories begin in my book. So for those of you who are curious about the book is totally nonfiction. Every single story in there is true. Even later stories in the book, which is not necessarily about me or my family, are from people from all walks of life who have encountered beings. And I put this together not just for ghosts and cryptids. There's also UFO encounters in there. There's a few stories about people who were abducted or people who feel like they were abducted. So it really is going from like this little town in the Philippines where all these hauntings and demonic infestations happen, all the way to something local, actually, just about 7 miles away from me. And I'm not going to name the town.
Sure.
So I started because I started actually as a UFO investigator from MUFON, which is one of the largest organizations in the US that deal with UFO investigations. I came upon that accidentally because a friend of my husband's was actually studying to be an investigator.
Right.
So as being an investigator, he had a book that he had been studying for an exam. We happened to be there for dinner, and I looked at the book and I said, boy, this is very, very interesting, because I was already into it pretty much. Next thing I know, I am ordering the same binder. I am studying it. I took the test, passed the test, and I was launched out there.
Right.
So some of the stories in the book is as a result of those most prominent cases that I encountered. That's how I got started.
Awesome. And how, I mean, so obviously UFOs are like a worldwide thing. But, you know, I spent a little bit of time in the Philippines. And when I say a little bit of time, it was about like a month and a half. I actually stayed there, but I can't get any kind of stories out of anybody out of the Philippines regarding UFOs. Or is it like a big thing out there, or is it kind of not as much, or is it just the culture of nobody wants to really talk about it? That's what I found really.
That's an excellent question, because it's interesting that you asked that, because when I was growing up, it seems like it's a taboo topic.
Right.
But culturally, because we're more into ghosts and spirits and hauntings, any kind of anomalous event like that, even lights in the sky, my own personal encounter with it is that people explain it away as some type of being or some type of ghost.
Right.
Because it's a very religious country, and you probably know it's 99.9% Roman Catholic.
Right.
We tend to ascribe, and I know the elders do as well, that it could be something that's demonic or something that's not holy.
Mm-hmm.
Lately, though, I think in the past 20 years, there has been a movement of a Filipino association that has come together to investigate these events and encounters as actual, beings from outer space
Right.
or from another dimension. I believe they're still together. They're still functioning as such. They kind of became official. They're also a volunteer corps, just like MUFON, smaller in scale, but
Right.
I believe that they're doing all the type of investigative techniques that MUFON did.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely interesting, and I can speak to that as well as like on the religious side of it. Um, it's a lot of the stories that I would hear, like from my wife and some of like her family as well. It's, I mean, like I said, I spent some time out there, and it was hard for them to tell me any kind of stories or for me to find anything out, because I was actually actively trying to figure out, if anybody had any kind of stories. And it's like a lot of local like legend stuff. Like you hear a lot of stories about like Aswang, or like my
Yes.
my family there. We had an instance, why I had an instance here in the States a while back, that they attributed to me getting an usog, if anybody's
Oh,
familiar with that as well.
yes.
I got extremely sick off of that as well. And they were just like, oh, you got a freaking usog. And I was like, what does that even mean? Right. But they kind of explained the whole thing to me. There's a lot of like weird, no, not weird, I guess weird to me because I'm not from there, but a lot of like stories like that, and like weird sayings, or like weird traditions and things that I just didn't understand. Like you shouldn't go take a shower after you get home, like from work, because you'll get sick and you have to wait like a few
Yeah.
hours before you jump in the shower. And I was just like,
Yeah.
it's like that's for me, or for anybody else that's not from there, you wouldn't understand like why. But there's a lot of little things like that out there, and it's just interesting. We haven't spent I haven't spent a whole lot of time out there. We plan to go back maybe next year, but um, it's and for me, the reason why I want to go back there is just to kind of investigate more of like all these stories about ghosts and all these like weird things out there.
Mhm.
And it's extremely interesting. And like you mentioned, a lot of that goes back to like World War II and all that stuff. And there's definitely a lot of stories about like hauntings like that because of that. It's extremely interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of background. The folklore, I believe, in the Philippines stems from people encountering
Right.
what we would call elementals here as well. I remember my grandmother telling me, if you go in the backyard and you encounter a small hill, don't kick it, don't try and dig it out, don't level it, don't touch it, because dwarves or elves live in them. Um, which comes to a story that's later on in my book, where that kind of event precisely happened. I won't give it away, and I won't,
Sure.
spoil it, but it does allude to the presence of elementals, um, or what they call nature spirits. Because the Philippines still has wild areas, probably even wild areas that are unexplored in the fringes of all different islands, different provinces in Luzon, I would imagine that those things harbor a lot of creatures, beings that are interdimensional.
Right.
And I think when you disrupt wherever they're living, they do come out and wreak vengeance, in one way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things I've noticed is that when there is tragedy, uh, for example, there is one event in particular in a township called Los Baños.
Mm.
If you're familiar with, and I'll say it, there's a major university in Los Baños. It used to be an internment camp. It was actually a university, but then in World War II, the Japanese used its gymnasium
Mm.
as a site to imprison soldiers. They put them in the basement of all places of the gymnasium.
Right.
They were chained, they were tortured, some of them were beheaded. It is a very active area. I actually flew out to visit friends and relatives in the area. I ended up staying probably about 15 minutes away from the campus of this university. And what I discovered just from talking to people was that there were real real hauntings there almost on a nightly basis.
Right.
Now, Paul, I don't know if you've been or know of the one I'm talking about. I don't want people to cluster there, but it's
I think I know of it. I've never
okay.
been out to. I mean, like I mentioned, the time that I spent out there. So my family's from Das Marinas. That's
Oh,
where they
okay.
live.
Mhm.
So, but I mean, outside of that, I mean, we spent a lot of time in Manila, up in the mountains and stuff like that. But nothing too like out, like far away from like the main cities or anything like that. Do you find that, or is it kind of widespread? But is it more like on the outskirts, like in the smaller towns? Because I didn't really hear too much about anything like in the major cities. Like of any kind of that
Uh,
activity or anything.
yeah, and I think that's universal all over the world. Is
Sure.
that when you have a major metropolis, noise, music, the presence of scores of people
Right.
tend to discourage any kind of a sighting. First of all, they don't like light, they don't like music. It's the lonely, far off little places,
Right.
those lonely lanes where there's probably just one or two people walking.
Hmm.
A lot of these things happen in the dead of night. What I've noticed is somehow once the sun goes down, anything can happen.
Right.
And a lot of the stories in the book are actually in the evening. There's one story where this young girl's sitting in the living room, and off to the left of her, the door is open, and the door connects to a driveway to the outside of the house. Perfectly nice living room, perfectly serene. You could kind of hear some of the neighbors as they're going on about their business. But once the light starts to fade and the twilight descends, she looked at the side of her eye just in time to see a man jump over the gate, and she heard the man's slippers,
Hmm.
what we call flip flops, beach
Chancla.
walks,
Yeah, a little chancla.
hit the cement of the driveway next to her. So she turns and she sees this guy who's wearing this long white sleeveless shirt. He looked emaciated. He was completely gaunt, like as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. And he just darted off all the way to the backyard. And this was at twilight. And she dashes to see if someone had broken into the house, and whatever it was just disappeared.
Yeah.
So you've got these things that kind of like come out in the dead of, at twilight or in the dead of night, those types of things. Would that happen if there were scores of people, if there was music going on? I have yet to hear of one where it happened that way.
Yeah, it's always convenient for them in a way, inconvenient for us because there's no way to prove if you're the only one there that something happened to you unless there's a whole group of people to see it. And it always seems to happen that way, which is unfortunate. But it's how I guess, is exorcism a big deal in the Philippines? Because I mean, I've heard stories of it happening, not as much. I mean, like in Mexico is where you hear where there's like the most exorcisms like in the entire world. But is do exorcism happen in the Philippines like often?
I'm sure it does, Paul. I don't know to what extent. Um, I got the impression that it was one method.
Right.
And I know that the Roman Catholic Church does take that very seriously.
Right.
How successful they are in the Philippines, I don't know. I don't know that there's officially a number of exorcists that live in the Philippines. My understanding is that it's a very specialized, you have to be highly trained
Right.
in order to perform the real kind. Um, and then there's, the whole myth of the what they call a mangkukulam, which is someone who casts a spell on someone. And the
Right.
implication there is that the person who's casting the spell is a witch.
Right.
Um, but I don't know that there's much that goes on in terms of a formal exorcism.
Right. Right.
Um, it In Italy, I know that there's a whole set of priests that have been trained. And my understanding is, and I don't know what the source of the information was, but I think about 5 years ago, I was told that there was a greater and greater number of people that were being exorcised in the Italian area.
Yeah, I know
So,
it's a huge issue in Mexico. The Pope has been out there twice, I think, just to address like the whole thing of because they worship saints that aren't like part of the Catholic religion, out there. So they have a lot of exorcisms that they have to do out there because of it, and it's getting into a real huge issue, especially now that everybody's locked down and a lot of people aren't working and there's no money going around. There's a lot of like crazy things going around the world
yeah,
now. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
yeah, and I guess to speak to that, I'm curious as to if cases have gone up now because everybody's locked down and everybody's starting to see things or everyone's starting to lose their mind out there. But um, have you noticed any kind of uptick in any kind of like activity as far as UFO or ghosts or anything like that here recently?
I don't, I'm not sure that there's much of an uptick per se. I know once in a while there are sightings and things of that nature. I'm trying to think of an article that I recently read, and I think it was either Twitter or Facebook, where there's certain areas. I think there's one in Florida that was a sighting recently. Um, I'm trying to think in terms of ghosts, if there's been anything that's an uptick. I didn't get that sense, although I would, that's interesting to research to see if there's been, because all over the world, there's a lot of rapid changes, as you know, that's going on. Um, Not all negative, but also positive and
Sure.
out of a spiritual nature. Um, Going back to possession, I mean, there is a case in my book that is actually one of not so much a possession, but I would say an infestation. And I think that the idea of demonic entities taking over people
Right.
has been with us since the beginning of time,
Yep.
since man has had, the ability to choose. Since he's become more and more materialistic, or maybe easily swayed by things that are not necessarily, from the bright side of life.
Right.
Uh, People who are chronically depressed tend to attract what they feel. That idea of whatever positive energy you have attracts positive, negative attracts negative.
Right.
I do believe that exists. I do believe that that is potent enough. I think our feelings are enough to make us attractive to
Right.
whatever is out there that is similar in the way we are.
Right.
But I'm not getting a sense that it's necessarily all negative that's happening right now. I think that there's a lot of good changes, a lot of things are being brought to light. So, and I won't talk political.
Oh yeah, we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's like I'm a firm believer that if enough people think about something, they can like wish it into existence, right? So like, say
Yeah.
somebody, you have like these mass sightings, let's say of like cryptids or something, and it's something that like never existed before, but all of a sudden you have like hundreds of people saying that they see the same thing, and then all of a sudden it's like a big thing, right? Here in the
Yeah.
States, I guess recently we had the Slender Man was one of those things that was solely created online, but then after
Yes.
like a year or so, all of a sudden everybody was seeing them like in the woods or like at
Hmm.
home and stuff.
Hmm.
And has anything like that happened in the Philippines where there's just like something that you knew wasn't there maybe last year, and then all of a sudden everybody's like seeing it, around their neighborhoods or stuff like that?
I don't know that there was, but there are instances. And I will tell you, one of the stories that's most pronounced in my book has to do with an entity that people have talked about from different angles. One angle is that it's a thought form.
Hmm.
And if you look at the Buddhist religion, if you look at the concept of a tulpa,
Tolpa, yeah.
uh, that is a manifestation of someone's thought energy. into something that you can actually see three-dimensionally. And when I say three-dimensional, I mean other people can actually see the being. It's kind of like the I don't know if you're familiar with the Harvey experiments, where everybody
Yes.
concentrated and suddenly there he is. I think it was a rabbit in this
Yeah,
case.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there was one where there was like this very friendly monk that they created. It was a monk. He was garbed, as a monk. He had the whole trappings of the cowl and everything, and he was friendly. That was something supposedly that lasted for several months. In the Philippines, there was an entity that looked a lot like Mothman.
Right.
Okay. And for some of my family members who are listening, they probably will recall this particular event. Some people have seen this Mothman-like creature. It stands about anywhere from 7 to 9 feet tall, from my understanding. It has the wings of a bat. Don't have nightmares.
No,
It
no, no.
has the face of a cow
Face of
and
a
the
cow.
eyes. Yeah, the face of a cow and the eyes of a goat. Your classic demonic energy with the goatee, the eyes that are yellow and pointed, the sense of menace that accompanies the sighting. So these are tropes of something that could be demonic. On the other hand, it could also be produced by a person who was severely depressed.
Right.
It showed itself to the person for several months. And the person actually got to the point where they felt like they had to end their life just to avoid the creature. So there's, on the one hand, the Roman Catholic Church, who's saying this is a demonic entity. This is something that can be regarded as an infestation of one human being. And then there is the other side of it, where they say it's a tulpa, it's a thought form. It was that particular person's energy, negative energy, that eventually built this creature up. It does show malignancy in the sense that there were 2 other people who witnessed whatever it was. It was hovering outside the window. One of the things that made me think it was actually a disembodied ghost or whatever it could be was that it would fade when you took a cross and put it against the window, and it would kind of fold itself up like as if it was a vampire trying to shield its eyes from a crucifix.
Yeah, it's definitely the whole Mothman with the head of a cow. That's definitely something I never heard of before. But that's, when you just think about it, if you were to catch that looking in your window, I would freak out, big
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
It's definitely something. It's crazy. And so it's like, unfortunately, I know the Philippines is kind of riddled with like suicide, and I've noticed that over the years. There's a lot of instances like that in our family, from the family members that live out there still. How does, I don't know if you've noticed that as well, but I've heard tons of stories of people that we know that have committed suicide out there. Is it just something that happens out there because it's just like a level of poverty it plays like a big role out there as well, and that that kind of feeds into the whole like demons and stuff like that actually live
Well,
out there?
Paul, I think, Paul, we can approach that from several different angles.
Right.
There's the theory that sometimes people are born having some kind of psychiatric condition that predisposes them to become depressed and eventually take their own life.
Right.
The other side of it is if you see how, and you're young, you haven't seen this, back before World War II. We've gone through so many good presidents. And once again, I'm trying to avoid politics, but sometimes it's not avoidable, as you could tell.
Yeah.
When we had Quezon, who was a wonderful president, we had Magsaysay, we had Osmeña, we had quite a trope of very good presidents, where the Philippines was in a position economically that rivaled Japan. Actually, we were surpassing Japan in trade, gross national product, you name it, we were up there.
Right.
You could see it in the clothing of the people. You could see it in the way the streets are paved, clean, very orderly. The kinds of foods that we produced, the kinds of products we exported, the kinds of things that came into the country, European products, things of that, this probably the Mercedes Benzes from Germany were used as taxi cabs.
Right.
But as time went on, and I won't say which president brought it on, that's not the topic of this, but as time went on, you have witnessed, and I am still witnessing, a decline of a country. And I'm sure it's multiple factors, not just one factor. But you're seeing hardship. You're seeing more and more people that used to party on a regular basis. And I don't mean like 3 or 4 people. I'm talking like huge weddings, huge birthday celebrations that were lavish, recede down to a much lower level of lifestyle. So I think that's one element that's causing the suicides, the difficulties in trying to make a living, or maybe not even finding enough work. So that's one corner of it. The other piece of it too is that because we are very religious, I think sometimes people kind of rely, and I'm not saying this to demean people who are religious, because I myself, I'm very religious, but sometimes we rely on an outside source to change or protect us from, let's say, poverty or illness. And if for some reason that doesn't happen, we fall into despair as a nation. And so I think that's another source, perhaps, of depression and then eventually suicide.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I've seen, especially now, that the whole lockdowns happen and stuff around the world. I mean, obviously that's happening more on a worldwide scale. Here in the States as well. I forgot, which story I was reading, but there's probably going to be more deaths, from suicide than the actual virus itself. And a lot of people losing jobs, and they can't afford to pay rent or like even feed their families and stuff. So it's unfortunately going to hopefully we're past like the worst part of it, but here for a while last year, it was pretty rough, like on everybody. Especially when the whole lockdown started, we kind of figured maybe a month, maybe 2 months, and we'll be out of it. It's going to be all right. But as time dragged on, like over the year, it was just getting worse and worse. And yeah, I mean, I would be, if I were to say that I didn't feel any kind of like a little bit of depression and stuff like that while we were in lockdown, I'd be lying, because I think for everybody, we all kind of felt that way. Like, when are we going to be able to leave our houses again? When are we going to be able to go out and do whatever we want? And it was just, it was rough. And I was a lucky one where I didn't lose my job. I was still working through the whole thing from home and all that stuff, which was great. But yeah, I have no doubt that fed a lot of it, worldwide. Unfortunately, there was a lot of, other things like that. But yeah.
And the fear is a huge thing.
Yeah.
When you have the TV set pummeling you with the same information night after night after night, and people caught on fairly quickly. I don't know if you noticed that they realized, if I shut off the TV and I don't watch the news, I'm not necessarily going to know how many have passed away, et cetera, because it's pushed people, I believe. This particular pandemic, and we have this every 100 years. This is not the first one, not that I've lived through one.
Right.
And I'm sure you haven't. So,
no, yeah.
But every 100 years, we have a new virus that gets introduced into the planet. This, I believe, is either the 29th or the 30th virus. If you notice, all the other ones are not being noticed anymore. You have to try pretty hard to get the Spanish flu these days.
Yep.
I think even if you ate dirt, you're not going to get the Spanish flu. And that was just 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So now we have COVID-19. What does that suggest? There must have been a COVID 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 18 somewhere along the line. This one is intimately connected to SARS, which, I think came from chickens, from what I recall. this one tends to really scare people. And I think the medium for that is the kind of way it's presented in the news. And it reminds me quite a bit of, when things are all serene and even and no one is rocking your boat, you reach for that scary book to entertain you. You reach for that suspenseful book, that mystery,
Yep.
to kind of titillate you to a level where you feel like, ooh, this is exciting. I'm not seeing too many people reach for that suspenseful book anymore, or that mystery, or the mass murderer type of genre, because they have enough fear in
Right.
their lives. So in that undercurrent, while they're working, there's always in the back of the head the idea of, I better have my mask on. Or you have the opposite effect. That's not going to affect me. I don't have to wear a mask.
Right.
So, and then all the different things, all the different polarities, this one's believing this one's believing that, the political affiliations, things of that nature. Everything kind of just gets dredged up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate. And you would think, from what you hear on the news and from everybody else, you would think that everybody was dying in the streets from it. But I mean, I don't know what it's like up there, but here, where I live, it's just not a big thing out here. I mean, yeah, we still have to wear masks to go into like stores and stuff, but
Mhm.
it's not like you don't have like crazy people on the streets like yelling at people like, you better put your mask on, or like, like you see on the
Yeah.
news. It's not. I mean, I live in a small town out here, so it's not that big a deal. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. And then I'm speaking to a lot of people. It's not going to get any better anytime soon. There's not going to be like one day where where they just tell us, all right, you can just not wear masks anymore. You guys can go out. It's probably never going to go away. We're going to be like this for a long time. We're just going to have to like incorporate it into our daily lives now. And it's just always going to be here. But hopefully everybody catches it and they get over it, and then we'll be fine. But yeah, it's not going to go away anytime soon. It's unfortunate.
And I'm not speaking as a scientist by any chance, or a researcher, or someone who's into epidemics, but I've been told by a number of people lately, every virus goes through variants.
Right.
They mutate. That's the nature of a virus. And I think it doesn't help when the news hypes it up like as if this is the very first virus that has variants, that has mutations, that
Yeah.
somehow, oh, we're done for. It's natural.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, don't undermine it, of course, use the precautions that you would use, double mask and things of that nature. But this happens every 100 years.
Right.
What for? I'm not sure. I mean, I'd rather not get into that, because I know there's a lot of different types of people who are talking. What is the reason for why we're standing still? And that's what's happening right now. We're just kind of standing still. But since the whole world is standing still, I think they should read my book.
Absolutely. Yeah, it'd be great. We need something to get our minds off of what's going on nowadays.
Yes.
It's unfortunately it took a pandemic for me to start reading books again. And I was like kind of hanging around the house and I didn't have much to do. And I was like, oh, I'll just start reading books. And it's unfortunate. I mean, because nowadays everybody just has like YouTube and everyone's on Facebook, and nobody has time to pick up a book anymore, or even want to. Our attention spans are so short that if it's not
This is
like
true.
in 30-second clip, I don't want to see it. Or so it's unfortunate, but highly suggest that everybody sits down one day and starts reading books or whatever they can. It'll take your mind off of a lot of things, and it's a great way to spend some time, or even just speak to your families, because I know a lot of people out there don't hang out with their families anymore. And this was probably one of the benefits of the virus. A lot of people were just kind of running around prior to like working or doing their own thing, and then now they were forced to stay at home with their families and like hang out with their wife or hang out with their kids.
Mhm.
That was the plus side of it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because, before this, we had people just running willy nilly, oh, well, let me eat dinner first and then I'm off. Let me do this and so on. The kids are all staring at their cell phones. And now these days, it's like, yeah, you have no choice. You got to, stay at home and eat and do whatever you need to do to be together. It's a great time to pause and reflect. You were mentioning books, and I know there's some books out there that are pretty thick novels,
Yeah.
and you have to kind of maintain concentration. I know that I have a little bit of ADHD, and when I wrote my book, I thought about people who probably won't have time to really immerse themselves into one long story. So what I did with mine is I cut them off so that every few chapters there was a different story.
Mm.
Um, I think it rivets your interest because it's a quick read. You get the substance of it in a few chapters, and then you move on to a different type of haunting or maybe a UFO sighting. There's some that are local that are
Mhm.
here in Pennsylvania, where I'm based, and then there's some that are overseas.
Right.
And of course, the beginnings of the book were all in the Philippines. And it's all rooted in the idea of a country who has seen so many wars, and particularly World War II.
Right. And it's interesting. So when it comes to the Philippines, are the cryptids any different from what we have maybe here in the States? Is there like a lot of water monsters because you guys are way out there? Is there not like, I know you described the Mothman looking creature, but is there any maybe kind of particular ones that are only from the Philippines that we wouldn't get out here?
Well, I don't know if there is such a thing as a capre, Kapre.
Okay.
I know that when I was young, I was told, don't go in the woods in the dark because you will meet the capre. And it's supposed to be a creature that comes out of a tree
Hmm.
and lives in the tree, kind of like an elemental, but it is terrifying. It
Right.
actually looks kind of like reptilian almost. It's very tall and it's got the huge eyes. And there's a story in the book that actually deals with that, a family that's eating dinner. And one side of their dining room actually opens out into a dark courtyard.
Hmm.
Um, it's funny because when you're seeing these things, you don't necessarily see the whole entire body.
Right.
You're just seeing, like, they're in the dark, so they're kind of shaded. Um, you also have I don't know if you've heard of the smoking man.
Yeah.
He usually wears a hat. He is in shadow, and you see cigarette smoke,
Right.
so it seems like he's a silhouette. So how is he different from something like a capre? You can't really see a clear definition of these things. So those I've heard of here in the US.
Right.
I have seen them in the Philippines. The capre, I don't know if they're something that actually seen here in the US or in Europe for the
Sure.
matter. I know in the Philippines they have been seen.
Yeah, it's like I mentioned, I was trying to get stories out of, like my wife and stuff, but she's had a lot of experiences when it comes to like entities as far as maybe like on the spiritual side. So we actually met in Bahrain. So I spent like a year out there. She was out there as well, and she used to have a lot of like hauntings and stuff out there. Um,
In Bahrain.
yeah, yeah. So like she used to have like a lot of weird dreams and stuff, and then when she would wake up, she would actually see that entity like in the room or like around her as well. um and so I never got any kind of stories like from her time. What when she was in the Philippines, she would tell me of stories that like have happened to other people or stuff like that. But when it came to stories about her, like it was just like overseas while she was there, which was weird. But yeah, it's a lot of weird things. Like, and so like I wanted to see if you could kind of explain to me a little more what the aswang is exactly, because I hear stories about that all the time, from her and from other people, but I never get any kind of explanation as to like what it is or like how that works.
Well, traditionally, the way it was explained in folklore, the aswang is something almost like it's vampiric,
Okay.
that it takes children, and what it does is it takes their blood.
Hmm.
So when you think about the Dracula myth, the vampire stories that come out of Transylvania,
Right.
we have that in common with the Aswang. How it physically appears, I don't know.
Sure.
I do have a story of an Aswang in my book as well. I've got everything in there, actually. It's
Yeah.
like the kitchen sink.
Yep.
And in this particular one, it was about a couple whose child eventually was taken by one. Um, I'm trying to remember exactly where it was. I think it was in the far reaches of the north. So if you go to Luzon, this was a vicinity that was way, way far into a very rural area where it happened, because it had plantations all over.
Sure.
And this couple were tenant farmers. They worked the land for, what they call a landlord back then, or a landowner. And it came across to me from another source, completely different source, actually from a tourist. And then I kind of just distilled the story into what it was, to try to prevent anyone from identifying who they were or their actual location.
Right.
What I do is I collect stories from all over, and I change the locale, I change names of people just to protect them.
Right.
I have been still getting stories, actually, in drips and drabs, not as much as I have with this one. Basically because of the COVID, I can't travel.
Yeah.
So that's completely squelched. When something comes my way, I like to be able to physically investigate what they're alleging, what they're talking about. And part of that for me is to actually interview the witnesses.
Sure.
Because of the pandemic, once again, I can't do that. All I can do is, go there when they're not there and maybe call them on the phone, which is kind of different. It's one step removed from the actual real interview. So
Sure.
that's frustrating in one way. But I'm sure there's a lot of things that are happening right now. You mentioned earlier, is there an uptick? And that's a good question. I think when the pandemic is over, we'll find that there's a lot of people who have not reported anything
Right.
for one reason or another.
Yeah.
So,
And it's definitely interesting. It's, you would think maybe everyone's kind of hanging around the house and they're just starting to see more things or experiencing more things. And that's just what you would probably guess would be the case. And, not to say that it is, but it's just the world's kind of slowed down a little bit more now. And there's a lot of people at home, maybe they're starting to notice things, they're outside, whatever. But now you would think that they'd probably be seeing a lot more out there. And hopefully, like you said, once all this virus thing's over, if it's ever gone soon, but hopefully they start to report like a lot more things. And I'm sure we're going to hear stories about, a lot of people experiencing things over their time being locked down and just like at home or, stuff like that. But it's definitely going to be interesting to see. Hopefully it actually did happen. So that should be good for somebody out there when they actually get those stories and write a book about it or something. But I'm definitely looking forward to seeing if anybody comes forward, afterwards.
Well, Paul, I think that long ago, there was always a stigma, all the way to the 80s, I believe, where people were really, really just filled with trepidation about reporting strange incidents, sightings. And you'll be surprised when someone starts reporting, everybody else follows.
Yeah.
Because they were just waiting for that one or two people to actually say, okay, there's nothing wrong with me.
Right.
Okay, I've got a full deck of cards here, and I'm going to tell you this is what happened to me.
Sure.
One of the landmark cases that that we've been hearing about, which was I believe it was written by Kathleen Martin, who is now a famous UFO investigator,
Sure.
of the Betty and Barney Hill case.
Mm-hmm.
That's still being discussed on Facebook. That's something that's still very prominent. Her book is a bestseller. I think Betty and Barney Hill was a landmark case that allowed other people to actually have the courage to come forward.
Right.
And it was not just a simple, I saw a light in the sky. This was an encounter that lasted all night long, from what I understand.
Sure.
So because we have more and more people coming forward, we have less reluctance. And I think it has to do with whether people are feeling that even the most conservative people will report. And if they do, then they will.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting.
Yeah. It's definitely unfortunate that, everybody out there that's had some kind of experience feels that they, like they can't share anything, for fear of ridicule, which is unfortunately the first thing that happens to anybody who says, I saw a UFO. And then you get those people out there that are like, oh, you're
Mhm,
crazy. Or maybe you saw something else, or, and it's unfortunate because there's a lot of people out there that have like real stories, real good stories too, I'm sure.
mhm, mhm.
How many people have actually gone to the grave, with their stories because they were just more afraid of what other people were going to think than
Yeah.
we're afraid of
And
like the
you
actual
think
thing.
about it too, is that when they are working, um, if their employer
Mm,
hears about it,
yep.
what's going to happen to them as a result of that? So you're going to see a lot of people who are in highly respected positions becoming more reluctant to explain something of that nature.
Yeah, it's so it's
So,
it's it's unfortunate in that case because I know. So I spent some time in the military, and I know a lot of people in the military that I was in there with that have some great stories, but they would never say anything because they're still in the military right now, and
yeah,
they don't
yeah.
want to get sent to freaking medical or for some kind of psychiatric stuff. And even people that I know that I'm related to that are cops, or even like other people that I know that are border patrol, they would never say anything either because they're still working and they don't want to get fired or whatever. But it's unfortunate because I've heard a lot of their stories and they're freaking amazing, and but they're just not out there, and they probably never will be because they'll never speak to anybody about it. Which is
Or
sad.
they'll make up stories.
Yeah, that's like another side of it because they'll start making up things just to kind of not get in trouble, and then that whole story's gone. It's just gonna take on like a life of its own some other way, and we're just never gonna hear the real one. But yeah, it's definitely unfortunate. And like I said, I have a lot of people that have some really great stories I wish that they could tell, but I don't think we'll ever hear about them. And some of the past shows I've spoken about some of my experiences and stuff, but um yeah, it's nowhere near any kind of the stories that they have, which is unfortunate.
Speaking of military, it reminds me, what you're saying reminds me of the Rendlesham Forest case,
Right.
which is in England. And there's the official story from people who were actually there that walked through the woods and actually touched the object that landed. They saw the writings on the side of the hull.
Hmm.
They had the electromagnetic reactions to the object. Um, it's very interesting, their account versus another person's account who will go unnamed, who apparently was not there, from what I understand.
Sure.
So you're going to get the one that's the legitimate story, which is the fact that based on actual experience. And then you're also going to get the one that's more fiction. And I think with ufology, the tough part is trying to weed the wheat from the chaff, trying to find the legitimate story and then the one that's just blowing smoke. And I think that's what incriminates ufologists, is when you have these people who go into their crystal ball and figure, I'm going to get some fame here. And I'm not
Right.
saying everybody is after that. Maybe they think they saw something. Maybe they feel that they have encountered something. I don't know.
Right.
But I think for the most part, you have to really scrutinize the information and get collaborative evidence. The more people see something, the more people encounter the same thing, the more validity you're going to get.
Right.
But some of these things don't lend themselves to things of that nature. And that's what makes it difficult. It could be that that person encountered it because, as we said earlier in the show, they were alone. And these things tend to happen in remote places.
Right.
Um, but like the Hudson Valley sightings, where you had a whole slew of people, it was almost like every block there was something happening on this road, on this highway at this time. That's undeniable.
Right.
That's
Right.
obviously a flap.
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's so I guess in Pennsylvania is there has there always been like a kind of history of like major UFO sightings, or is it just kind of here and there, like everywhere
That's an
else?
interesting question. And Paul, I'm glad you mentioned that because in 2008, when I was just freshly trained as an investigator, we had a flap.
Yeah.
It was centered in Bucks County, which is on the very southeastern fringe,
Mm,
almost close to the New Jersey border of
right.
Pennsylvania. So this is a very small county. Um, and in that intensity, we were looking at over 700% increase in sightings,
Wow.
going all the way from April all the way up to November.
Right.
People were actually running ragged when the organization began here in Bucks County. I think there was only maybe one or two people who investigated, and
Mm,
it has grown since then because of the flap. And I think it's died down now, but at the time when it was happening, all hands were on deck.
yeah.
um, my book actually talks about the most prominent cases I came across because I was, they call it the STAR team.
Mm,
And what that is you go on dispatch and you're actually live watching cases across your screen being reported by people as they're being typed in.
right.
And what you're doing is you're monitoring, how prominent is this that we should send someone on the ground within 24 hours. So I would call these people, I mean, real live people that just typed in the incident, and I would talk to them about what happened to them, exactly what the nature of it is. And so some of the stories are in that book, and I've distilled them in such a way to make it a little bit more, visual,
Right.
because people can't see what they see. They didn't take pictures and things of that nature. But yes, that was from 2008, April, all the way to November. And I think it even went close to January in some respects.
Right. Right. How,
Yeah.
so how, so I have friends that live, like on the border between New Jersey, Pennsylvania, like out there. How rural is that area? Is it pretty rural? Because I see them going hunting out there, and you would
Yeah.
think like I look at them and I'm like, you guys are from Jersey, like you guys are going hunting, like this
Uh-huh.
doesn't kind of make sense. So I wanted to see how rural it was out there.
It's not as rural as maybe the northwestern quadrant of Pennsylvania. So if you're
Okay,
looking at Pennsylvania, one end has Pittsburgh, the other end has Philadelphia.
sure.
I'm in the Philadelphia corridor.
Okay,
The Pittsburgh area has more rural in the true sense of farmland, rolling hills. Um, it really is you've got Bigfoot out there.
right.
We haven't had Bigfoot over here.
Okay,
Not that I know of anyway. Okay.
sure.
We have Dogman out
Ah,
there.
yep.
We have all those creatures that, because there's space,
Yeah.
you've got the predator creature, which is, shows itself as transparent or
Mm-hmm.
translucent, just like in the movie.
Sure.
That's also way up there. Down here, you could say it's more suburban.
Mm,
And in some areas, you be driving literally 10 minutes and suddenly there are no street lights. So
mm,
you have pockets of rural areas. You
right.
have lonely lanes, and then you've got the river, the Delaware River. Um, that's a very interesting river because of the fact that there's houses,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, that line along there. And then you've got copse of woods that have no one. People have seen things in the woods
Right.
across the river. So you'll have that, but it's not a continuous flow of rural areas,
Okay.
although there has been some really uncanny encounters
Yeah.
along that river.
Yeah. So I've been trying to get. So I have one friend in particular. He lives out there, and so he's like an outdoorsman. Like he's always outdoors. He goes fishing, kayaking, hunting, and all that stuff. But now he works for the forest services. Like he's out there now. He's like a ranger and stuff. But
With the ranger, yeah.
yeah, so I doubt now that I could get anything out of him, even if he'd see something. But um, I've him, like I have him on my radar now even more because he's a ranger, that he's going to
Yeah.
be out there working out there. And I had always told him, like, hey man, if you hear of anything out there, just let me know, like what's going on, because he's always out there. Like I
Hmm.
said, he goes
Hmm.
hunting all the time and stuff like that, so he's always in the woods. But now that he's going to be working for the park services, I want to know, like, what you see, like any kind of stories you
Yeah.
hear out there.
But the
Um,
question is, would he tell you?
yeah,
He
exactly.
can, friend, but not officially.
Yeah. So I mean, we were actually in the military together, so we were stationed together and all that stuff. And he's like a really good friend. But I told him, I was like, hey, I know you probably don't want to say anything because you want to keep your job and you're new, but let's get together or something. You can tell me like all your stories. I won't even say that it's you. I'll make up a name or something, but I want to know what's going on out there because that's that area out there. I know of it, and I just didn't know anybody who actually lived out there until I met him, and I didn't know like how rural it was. And always hear stories of other things like out in the city, like Mothman or like Spring Hill Jack and all that kind of stuff up there,
Mhm,
but
mhm,
you would never hear it until you just said that you heard stories about Dogman up there. I hadn't heard any kind of stories about that up there, which is
mhm,
great. I had heard of stories about Bigfoot and stuff like that, but it's just you just wouldn't think that there would be anything out there because it's so close to the city, and I just didn't know how rural it was. But
mhm.
yeah, it's definitely looking forward to hearing stories from him. Hopefully about that in the future, because I'm going to be pressing him hard over time here.
You
So
can't get him on the show though.
no, I won't be able to. I mean, maybe I could. I mean, we'll just have to block out his face or just maybe not show video. I can just interview him with his voice. That's great. But yeah, it's interesting because I've never visited. I mean, I've been to New York and stuff like that, but like those areas out there, I never stopped there or anything like that. So I mean, the closest I've been is actually New York, and then I think I've been to DC a few times, but to get like up there, it's just kind of like
Well, upstate New York is pretty rural.
yeah,
Um,
that's weird
and
too.
if you go towards, I'm trying to think of the Albany, Binghamton, you're going towards the Lake Superior area.
Right.
And if you cross over into Pennsylvania, you're going to find the thick of the rural area. You're
Mm,
going to see mountains and homesteads that just go on forever. And at night, they're pitch dark.
yeah.
There's certain areas, even of Connecticut, which is a pretty small state where I'm originally from. If you go to Winsted, Connecticut, towards the fringes of the New York border,
Mm,
um, I don't know if you're familiar with Danbury. Danbury
yep.
is a pretty neat little town, but if you go above Danbury, it's just all farmland. And anything can happen there, anything
Yep.
in the dead of night, or, and there's actually a story in my book about Bigfoot,
Mm,
a lady who lived alone, and she was up in Pennsylvania towards the New York border where
right.
it happened.
So, is there any kind of creature like Bigfoot in the Philippines? I mean, there's
Oh,
yeah,
that's an interesting question because yes, there is.
yeah,
Um, that came my way. I only knew about that. I was actually about maybe 8 or 9 years old, and I was still living in Manila. And a friend of mine
hmm,
loves comics. We used to go to Frontier Supermarket. Either her mother would pick me up or my mother would take us.
right.
We would go see a matinee, and then at the supermarket there were stacks and stacks of comics.
Hmm,
Um, and there was one where I just simply just picked it up out of the blue. I thought this looked really weird. Um, it was a creature that was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. It kind of looked like a very pale gorilla,
hmm,
and it was called a batbatan utan.
okay.
Yeah. So actually, I haven't Googled it yet, and I've been curious. For some reason, I'm not remembering to do it. But that comic strip, later on, years and years later on,
Sure.
I saw again in a very interesting format. It's a picture, and you're probably familiar with it. It's called the Patterson Gimlin film,
Right.
and it looks starkingly very much like that comic strip,
Hmm.
but Batan Utan. So yes, I believe Bigfoot is universal.
Yeah, I mean, you would think, right? Because the Philippines, there's a lot of areas that are kind of unexplored still. It's like if you go up into
Yeah.
the mountains and stuff, there's little islands and stuff like that there's nobody out there really. And you would think that there'd be something existing out there, but at the same time, because it's kind of off on its own, I mean, the only way to get there is by plane or like on a
Hmm.
boat. So you would kind of
Yeah.
think that it wouldn't make it out there. But I mean, obviously, there's all kinds of stories out there, I'm sure, about it, which is weird. Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's
you wouldn't even necessarily need to get on a plane. Like if the next time you go and visit, if you actually go down around, I'm trying to think of the name of the town, but if you go south from Manila,
okay.
okay, and you keep going south until you hit the town of Calamba,
Okay.
okay, go past Calamba, and then you start going, I believe it's going east.
Right.
Okay, and for those of us that are not too good with geography, what you're doing is you're approaching the water line,
Yeah.
and if you look on Google Earth, you're going to see nothing but forest,
Yeah.
one right after the other. And that's in the province of Laguna. That is virtually unexplored because people in the Philippines tend to cluster in towns and cities.
Right.
And when there isn't conveniences of electricity or plumbing, they don't go.
Yeah.
And developers don't want to go that far simply because people can't find work there. And the traffic makes it so prohibitive. Why would you want to live 3 hours away from the city?
Yeah.
But the interesting part is because of that, the developers don't want to go there. It's isolated and it's still pretty pristine. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's totally unexplored. Like the whole very topmost part of the Philippines is also pretty unexplored.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, I don't know that developers go all the way up there.
No, maybe not anytime soon. I mean, the fear of like all the tsunamis and stuff like that happen out there, it's
Yeah.
rough. Every year there's always like one or two that's real bad.
Hmm.
We spent a lot of time in Tagaytay when I was up there. And then you get down to like what is it, Mount Mount, Mount Banahao is like
Oh,
the big one.
Banahaw. Yeah.
Yeah, out
Yeah.
there. But I mean, yeah, there's a whole lot of areas like in between that you kind of see people here and there, not too much, but like you said, it's not like everything's explored really.
Have you been to Mount Cristobal, the Twin Mountain?
No, I haven't. Mm-mm.
Okay. Don't go.
Okay. Okay, that's a good one then. Yeah. No, I've never been. It's. I mean, we had like a whole thing planned like for last year as well, but obviously everything got shut down, and then this year's not gonna look too good either. So, I mean, we're gonna have to see when we can finally make it back out there. Hopefully next year. But because like we got married out there, so that's
Right.
that's where we got married and stuff like that. So it's her family's still out there, which is great. Like I want to visit because up until I met her, I had never. I mean, I heard of the Philippines, but like anything to do
Hmm.
with the Philippines, I didn't have any idea. But and that time that we stayed there, it was great.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just
It's a
like
lot of fun. There's a lot of stuff to do.
yeah, and
Yeah. And
I
if you're
was
a hiker, it's incredible.
yeah, and like for anybody that doesn't know, like if you've been to Mexico to like some like the smaller, I guess, kind of cities on the border, that's what it reminded me of when I got there. Like when we were in Manila for like a week, it's just like if I was in like freaking Juarez in Mexico, which is like a border town right next to Texas,
Hmm.
in El Paso. It looks exactly like it, like all the stalls on the side, all the cars, and like the people walking around all day.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
just like, am I in Mexico? Like it's
Yeah.
exactly what it
Yeah.
felt like to me, which is
I think
great.
it's interesting because the Philippines, even though it's in Asia and it's right in the middle of Asia,
Right.
it has more of a Hispanic feel. It has
Yeah.
more of a Latino type of vibe to it. And
Yeah.
that was exactly the same experience I had. Having returned like years later, several years later, I
Mhm.
was looking at it from the a perspective of an expat.
Right.
I wasn't looking at it from the perspective of a native anymore because I myself have changed.
Right.
But so I was looking at it through the eyes of a tourist, and I thought, my gosh, this feels more like Colombia
Mm.
or Costa Rica or something like that. It doesn't feel like an Asian country.
Yeah.
And then you realize you're just, like one quick plane flight to China away, or Thailand or Indonesia. But
Japan.
yet, our customs and our dress and our food, I love our food.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Yeah. I mean, I get that feeling because of the Spanish, they were there obviously, but everyone has like a Spanish last name, and we
Yeah.
speak to people and it's like, what's your last name? Rodriguez, whatever. And it's like, yeah, I thought you're Filipino. It's like, yeah, I am. And it's like you mentioned, the food is great. I mean, my wife, obviously makes all her food here and all that stuff, but it's great. I mean, we like I mentioned, if when I first got there, got off the plane in Manila and stuff like that, and I thought I was in Mexico. Like that's what it felt like. Everybody's out there, everybody's friendly, everybody's nice, but the traffic is horrendous, and so we sat in traffic for hours before we can get anywhere. But I mean, it was great. We had a whole bunch of fun, and there was like plans, like I said, to go visit and see all the beaches and stuff like that. But we'll have to wait. I mean, we could use it right now because it's like 20 degrees here right now, but
Oh, I bet. Yeah. If you ever do visit the beaches, go to Boracay. That's a
yeah,
wonderful, wonderful place. And there's so many restaurants just all along the beach. I was floored.
yeah,
When we were just walking down the beach, I thought, there was a German restaurant, there was a Dutch restaurant, there were all kinds of cuisines all
yeah.
over the place. But just the vibe of it too. It's just incredible, and it's unspoiled.
Yeah, well, hopefully it stays that way, but it doesn't look like it. There's a lot of stuff, even though it's still kind of largely unexplored. There's like a lot of people moving in there, and I mean, at least there was prior to the pandemic. But some of the beaches they were having to clean up again because they were just like littered with trash and stuff. And
Oh, that's a shame.
so it's hopefully it stays the way it should, and there's not like a whole bunch of people moving in. But it's just like one of those things when people discover something and they really like it, they have to bring the houses and the businesses over, and it just spoils everything. But
yeah.
So it's,
and the ancestral homes, it's worth seeing. But one thing about ancestral homes, once again, you never know who passed away in there. They're very old. My family has an ancestral home that was built in the late 1800s, still standing to this day. I still have a relative that lives there.
right.
And it has some interesting stories. In the spine of my book, I actually have pictures from a bedroom in that ancestral home. And Paul, if you have a copy of the actual book, not Kindle, but the actual book,
Right.
I don't know if you've seen the armoire in one of the pictures.
No, not yet. I'm waiting for that book to be delivered.
Oh,
I
no.
purchased it, but yeah, it's on the way.
So when you get the book, I believe it's in the spine of the book. Yes, it's in the middle.
Okay.
I think it starts at page, I'm just going to quickly look through here. It starts at page 102.
Okay.
And there's pictures of different parts of this particular house that I'm talking about.
Okay.
A lot of people who have read the book have mentioned to me what they saw in the picture. I won't tell you what they saw. There's a couple of elements that's totally off
right
about that particular picture.
Okay.
I'll say no more.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, we'll get it and we'll look for it. We'll track it down. Yeah. No worries. Well, Ms. Rocha, so as we come down to the end of it here,
okay.
Can you, I guess, let people know where they can? Are you still doing work for MUFON, or is it?
No, I am not with MUFON anymore. Okay. I do have the Facebook page under my name, Adele Rocha. My book can be purchased through Amazon. It is not available in bookstores at this point. Okay. It is now in limited quantities. It's been running on Amazon for a couple of years now.
Right.
Because of the pandemic, it has, just like anything else, anything with negative content, not negative as in bad, but scary content, tends to not do as well because people are stressed and fearful already.
Right.
But it is on Amazon as a Kindle and as a paperback. I would say that it has a 4.5-star, 5-star rating.
Right.
So
that's awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm waiting for it to get here. Just start reading it. I mean, like I mentioned, I started picking up books like everywhere that I can, and like all our
Hmm.
guests, like I'll buy their books and like I'll start reading it and stuff. And I mean, I have a stack of books out here that I've been reading like the past month, and I don't even like get through a book before I start another one. So I'll start a book, get like halfway through, and then I'll start another one. I'll be reading both at the same time, and then it's just back and forth. So
Sounds like
it's
me.
yeah. It's just, I mean,
Yeah.
among other things like work, school, and studying all kinds of things on my own, and it's just it's packed all day
Wow.
long. But yeah, we'll
Yeah,
get through
that's
it.
good. That's a
Yeah.
good thing. Keep
Yeah.
busy.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
need to. But yeah, I mean, so we could find you on Facebook, like you mentioned, and Twitter as well. I'll
Yeah.
have all the links, down below in the show
Hmm.
notes for everybody. But I just want to thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on with us
Thank
today. And
you for
yeah,
having me.
absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Are there any plans for any kind of books in the future?
I'm hoping that once the pandemic is over, I can assemble whatever emails I've gotten from people. This is also one thing I have told people in past shows, that if they have an interesting story to tell, they can reach out to me through Facebook Messenger.
Right.
A lot of times what happens is they reach out to me, they share with me either a phone number or an email address. I'm pretty good about emailing them back, and then they can compose the story that they have. I
Right.
always guarantee anonymity. Sometimes I'll vary or change the area or the town just so people don't flock to them, or, assail them with questions when they find them on the street.
Sure.
Um, I also, if it is part of the book, the sequel to the book, if it becomes part of my next book, I will send them a complimentary copy of the book.
Okay. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. So I highly recommend everyone grab the book, because I'm actually waiting for it to get here as well to start reading it. But we'll have all that linked down below in the show notes, as well as social media, Facebook and Twitter as well. Like I said, thank you very much for your time, ma'am. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. I had some great stories about about the Philippines, and hopefully we can all get back there one day, sometime soon. But
I hope so.
yeah, absolutely. Everybody else, I really appreciate you guys stopping into the show as well. Like I mentioned before, if you guys are catching us on YouTube and you aren't already a subscriber, please consider subscribing for us. Hit that bell icon as well as that thumbs up icon as well. Like I mentioned before, if you guys are catching us on the go or you want to, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeart Radio at Truth Defender Podcast. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Rumble, which will have all linked down below in the show notes. We have a Discord as well. And if you want to send us any kind of questions or comments from myself or our guests, you can send that to the Truth Defender 1776 at gmail.com. Once again, thanks a lot, everybody, for stopping in. I really appreciate your time. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy out there, stay blessed, and most of all, stay frosty.